what is an MBO? What is
the management buyout, which is kind of effectively, as the name suggests, I guess, it's the business owner selling the business to the management. It's the ultimate in that kind of friendly succession and that motivation for people to say, look, if you stick around and work with me, we grow the business together, then at some point I'll let you take the reins, you take the business off me and grow it into the future even more. And then they get much more of a sense of, well, actually, I've got a real opportunity for a really big realization event. It's not just 10% of the shares, it could be 50, 60, 100% of the shares. So you're kind of offering the employees the ability to buy in a I don't want to say more meaningful way, but in a much more substantial way. And typically the way that the MBO might be structured, again, the concern for employees is always, well, where am I going to find the money to actually pay?
Because for this, they would actually need to effectively buy the shares, exchange in some way or form, which you'll come on to.
Correct.
And there will also therefore be tax implications for whoever is selling or diluting their shareholding.
Absolutely right. So essentially we are looking at a sale of the business owner's shares here. Typically in a growth share or an EMI situation, it's new shares that are issued. Not always, it can be, for EMIs, it can be existing shares, but typically it's new shares that are issued. Here, the business owner is actually actively selling their shares. So you're right, from their point of view, that's a capital gains tax disposal. You're going to pay tax on the gain that you make at whatever rate Rachel Reeves decides that you're going to pay on 30th of October.
And they'll pay that tax on the full value even if they don't get the cash straight away.
Correct. Yeah. There's different ways to structure an MBO, but typically the way that it will be structured is there'll be some cash up front, and we'll talk about where that cash comes from in a moment. And then they might retain a proportion, so they might retain 10, 20, 30%. But also there might be an element which says, actually, again, there's a bit of jam tomorrow, you're going to get paid more out, but you might get paid that in 12 months, 2 years. Typically how that's structured is deferred, what we call deferred consideration. So it's a fixed amount, you're going to get that, it's just delayed. So they would pay tax on, the individual would pay tax on that as if they'd received the cash on day one. You can structure it so there's a deferral of that tax. So what we call loan notes, for example, which would mean that you only pay the tax when you're almost lending the money back to the company. You only pay the tax when the company pays you back on that, in inverted commas, loan. You pay tax in the year that you get the cash rather than, upfront, which is good in one sense because you're kicking it down the road. But again,
if you don't know what's going to happen with tax and things will be changing a lot.
You are taking an element of risk. So it's about, again, part of our role in that is sitting down with the business owners to help them to understand the different implications of how they structure the transaction and help them to make a decision on what works for them.
And while we don't have a crystal ball, at least you can put those, the pros and cons and the ifs, buts, maybes in front of them.
But ultimately, it's a little bit of a leap of faith. And I think and again, we'll touch on where the cash comes from. But typically, an MBO will realise less for you than a trade sale. When I say a trade sale, what I mean is selling to a competitor or even potentially to a private equity
or a conglomerate.
Exactly. Yeah. So
easy for me to say.
Yeah. So you're giving up a little bit of the value for ease of transaction. It's a much less stressful transaction. You don't get somebody crawling all over the books and doing massive due diligence exercises. I almost said DD then.
Well done.
Yeah,
well done.
I tried to avoid it.
Another acronym. DD, due diligence.
So there is this trade-off. An MBO will typically get you a lower price, but it's an easier transaction. And for our business owners, it's not just about the money. It's about preserving the legacy. It's about looking after those people who've helped them to grow. And this is where
looking after the people, and also that culture that you might have in a business that could just get eaten up by a bigger company. And looking after the clients. So the team that you've grown around you and the clients that you look after, you want that ethos to last beyond you.
You absolutely do. So it is that legacy point that I think is really important, and people quite often are happy to trade some extra cash for actually preserving that legacy and looking after those people who've got them to where they are.
I'm going to throw another spanner in the works here before you come on to maybe talking about where the money could come from, because there's another type of sale, which is very, very similar to an MBO or a management buyout. And there are all sorts of acronyms. There's MBOs, there's management buy-ins, there's all sorts of different elements to this. We're not going to dwell on that now. But one of the real sort of buzzwords at the moment is your EOT, and that's an employee ownership trust. John Lewis is owned by the employees, Richard Sounds is owned by the employees. Now, there are tax benefits of doing that. There are, in my own personal opinion, this is only a personal opinion, there are ethical questions, I think, around some of the ways in which this is done. And there are potentially some loopholes which I would not be surprised if they don't get closed further down the line. But that aside, just give us a very high level, what's an EOT or an employee ownership trust?
So an employee ownership trust is not employee ownership. This is a sort of sad tax geek kind of moment here, but essentially an employee ownership trust is literally a trust that buys the shares in the company. The trust exists for the benefit of the employees, but the employees don't actually own the company. Now that might seem really pedantic, but it really makes a big difference in terms of what the tax outcomes might be if there's a sale down the line. And this is one of the challenges with EOTs that people don't think about. Is it's great now, and from the business owner's point of view, they can sell their shares to the trust, and as long as they sell more than 50% of the shares, then effectively that capital gain is tax-free. Now that makes it very simple. There's a lot of complex conditions that you have to meet to get over the line for that, but fundamentally, if you tick all those boxes, if you sell the shares to the employee ownership trust, then you don't pay any capital gains tax at all on the value that you get for your shares.
Perfect. I'm going to stop EOTs right there because it's such a huge subject that we'll do our own video on that. So it's just because it's another way that you could sell to the employees. And we were talking about that in terms of the MBO and management buyout. So back to the management buyout, how do the employees and get the money to buy the employer out, especially if it's a successful, growing business and they need to find a lot of money?
Well, interestingly, this almost does link back to EOTs in the sense that it's usually the same source of funds, which is actually
that's what made me think of it.
Exactly, which is generally the cash in the company. So that might sound a bit strange, as how can I as an employee use the cash in the company to buy the employers or the individual, the shareholders' shares? But it's a pretty standard structure for a management buyout.
But surely the employer or the owner is thinking, well, that's my cash.
Yeah, but that cash is reflected in the overall value that they're paying, and that's if they want their day one cash. And we do see what we call leveraged MBOs, where employees will go to a bank or a finance house and actually raise some funds themselves, but that makes it quite unattractive. And this is where the owner really has to think about, well, if I want to do this deal, I've got to kind of make it as easy as possible. And essentially, and I won't bore you with the details, but we can structure it so that the cash in the business is used as almost that day one cash, that down payment to the shareholder, to pay for a proportion of their shares. But this is
at least enough to cover their tax.
And again, this is where the commercials of the business kind of drive how the transaction's structured. So if you've got £1 or £2 million in the company, then that's a decent slug of money that you can pay out on day one. If the company's not particularly cash rich, then that makes an MBO challenging, but that may be where you go and say, well, actually, we want to raise some external debt. I think importantly, again, the management will typically form a new company to make the acquisition. And so it's that company that buys the shares. And what that means is if you go to borrow, for example, it's actually the company that's borrowing rather than the individuals. Now, the bank's going to want personal guarantees, but you do have a layer of protection. Even in the worst case, you've got to borrow.
Sounds like another one for the whiteboard. Or the
chart. I think it's there's as many different varieties of MBOs as you could kind of count, really. But I think the basic message is that typically management are not looking to find 1, 2, 3, 5 million pounds out of their own pockets in order to do an MBO. Often the business owner might want them to put in some of their own cash, what people charmingly refer to as pain or hurt money.
Skin in the game.
Skin in the game again.
Because it seems sensible, because otherwise, sometimes you want people to feel like they really it means something, I suppose.
Exactly. And I think it can feel like a bit of a low risk free ride for management in that situation.
And I have seen that happen with old clients prior to my role here, where they maybe gave away too much, and there was no pain, no skin in the game, whatever the terminology is, and the directors that had bought in really didn't become an owner's mindset.
No, I think that's massively important, and particularly when the owner, the existing owner, is going to be relying on management success in the future to get their deferred consideration. So if management think, well, actually, do you know what, I've put no money into this myself at all. If we make a total stuff up of it, and the thing goes pop, I've lost nothing. If you say to them, well, actually, do you know what, I'd quite like you to put 30 grand, 50 grand in, and that's money that you stand to lose if the thing goes south, might just change that mindset a little bit. So I'm not saying it's essential, but I do think to ensure that kind of motivation and that ownership mindset, and that isn't just, oh, well, Paul's given me the company for nothing, I can kind of do what I like with it now. Actually having a little bit of something on the table that says, I've borrowed this money against the house, or I've had to use my savings to put this money in, might just focus the mind enough. Because as the business owner, as I say, you're going to want to make sure that 10, 20, 30, 40, 50% of your total value that's getting paid out over time is actually going to come to you. Otherwise, you've walked away with and left a lot of money on the table. So it is about and this is why often owners will want to retain a stake, because they can
some sort of direction, or
exactly, almost like a non-exec role often. Challenge there is always, and this is a kind of not really a tax thing, but can the business owner step back enough to let management actually kind of run it their way as well? And this is where often we see that dynamic being quite interesting. So I think
challenging.
It's not just about getting the tax and the legal structure right. It's also being really clear about how the thing's going to run in the future, to make sure that management do feel, because it's fine to say put your money in, and because I want you to feel ownership for you, but then
you've got to be empowered to
if you don't empower them to have that ownership and to run it like a business owner, then they're going to be demotivated anyway. So there's a big mindset shift, both for management but also for the business owner, because they aren't the owner anymore.